Welcome to PsiHub, where we talk about forensic psychology, review the literature, analyze, scrutinize, and, most importantly, cultivate your interest and curiosity in this fascinating field of study. Despite living in some of the most peaceful times in human history, war never seems to really go away. On February 24th, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, marking a steep escalation in the Russo-Ukrainian War, which had begun in 2014. We will not attempt to discuss the specific events that led up to these atrocities. Instead, we want to ask a different question. What is there in man that makes him so ready to go to war across almost all cultures and socio-economic backgrounds? In this video, we will examine this question from three different perspectives: group identity, obedience, and conformity. Starting with group identity. Well, what actually is group identity, right? The American Psychological Association defines group identity as the image of a group, so the reputation and expectations held by its members or by those outside of the group. It's also defined as the individual's sense of self as defined by group membership. To illustrate, I invite you to think about the different groups that you belong to. So these could be a sports team, a group of friends, an online community, or the political party you voted for during the last elections. When you reflect on these different groups, think about how they affect you. Indeed, not only are you part of these groups, but they're also a part of you. In other words, group membership, in part, defines your very identity. So, groups tell us who we are and who we are not. In addition, groups also orientate and direct our emotions. We feel joy when we think about our fellow group members, just as much as we feel anger when a group member or our group as a whole is mistreated. What should be highlighted, however, is that the positive aspects of group identity tend to be limited to our in-group, the group to which we are a part of. This is the foundation of social identity theory, which was best illustrated by Jafal and colleagues in a 1971 experiment, where a classroom of schoolboys was randomly divided into two groups, even though the schoolboys themselves thought they were divided based on their preferences between two different paintings. Once in their separate groups, the participants were asked to divide rewards between the two classmates. Specifically, they could either divide the rewards to ensure maximum fairness, maximum joint profit, maximum in-group profit, and maximum difference in favor of the in-group. What the authors of the paper found is that if the two classmates were from the same group, so either the in-group or the out-group, participants chose to divide the reward to ensure maximum fairness. However, if the two classmates were from different groups, participants divided the rewards to ensure maximum difference, even if choosing another option meant that the in-group got more reward out of it. Essentially, rather than choosing an option where everybody benefited to the same degree, participants voluntarily chose to sacrifice their in-group in-group benefits to maximize differences between groups. This phenomenon is called positive distinctiveness. Remember, this between-group discrimination only arose because the schoolboys thought they were divided into different groups based purely on their preference between two paintings, an arbitrary and ultimately meaningless group differentiator. But what does this mean for real-world conflicts between groups, such as in war? Well, we would love to be able to tell you that when it comes to causing physical harm, humans act differently. However, this is far from the truth. The near-infamous Stanford prison experiment perfectly illustrates this. In 1971, Zimbardo and colleagues recruited normal and average students and assigned them to two different group roles: prisoners or guards. Importantly, there were no major differences between the group participants. In fact, Zimbardo and colleagues wrote in their paper that young men selected because they were normal on all the psychological dimensions we measured, many of them were also avowed pacifists. Now, the guards were given simple instructions: do whatever they thought was necessary to maintain order over the prisoners. Other than physical violence, nothing was off of the table. In keeping with Zimbardo's intention to create an atmosphere of oppression, each prisoner was made to wear a sort of dress as a uniform, and prisoners had to carry a chain padlocked around one ankle. The whole experiment was discreetly observed and videotaped by the authors. During the simulation, even though none of the participants were particularly violent to start out with, the experiment quickly escalated. After prisoners staged a rebellion on the second day, the guards devised a system of punishment and reward to reassert their control. Although the guards were not allowed to use physical violence per se, they were allowed to abuse their authority to humiliate the prisoners. They forced prisoners to do push-ups arbitrarily, restricted access to the bathrooms, and forced them to relieve themselves in a bucket in their own cells. This mistreatment of the prisoners escalated to an alarming rate, which led to Zimbardo himself terminating the experiment after only 6 days, even though the experiment was scheduled to last for 2 weeks. This experiment's outcome is strong evidence for the out-group abuse and violence. By assigning group identities, the group members' judgment can be impaired, potentially leading to unethical treatment of prisoners who are actually their own university peers. Overall, however, this group identity effect begs the question, how is it possible that anyone can resort to such cruel behavior to another human being who is part of a different group to one's own? Doesn't basic human empathy normally prevent us from committing such acts? Indeed, Zimbardo himself chose not to recruit people who showed highly psychopathic traits, which is associated with aggression, violence, and callousness. One such strategy we humans use are psychological distancing mechanisms, psychological tricks that help us convince or trick ourselves into committing actions we otherwise would never do. For instance, we can create psychological distance by internalizing a sense of superiority over someone else, either by simply believing that we are better than them, or using an abstract representation of this, such as rank, for instance. An extreme example of this is dehumanization, which is when you deny someone of their humanity in your own eyes. Unfortunately, well, history is littered with this. Nazi propagandists portrayed Jews as rats and parasites, and the Polish and Russians were called subhuman. At a 1971 event sponsored by Vietnam Veterans Against the War, one former Marine surgeon who served in the war said, "It wasn't like they were humans. We were conditioned to believe that this was for the good of the nation, the good of our country, and anything we did was okay. And when you shot someone, you didn't think you were shooting a human. They were a gook or a commie, and it was okay." And please, don't believe for a second that dehumanization doesn't exist anymore today. Take the Ukrainian war with Russia.
Вы правда думаете, что им нужны ваши ебучие хохлушки, вот эти свиньи, блядь, которых переебали вдоль и поперек, ходячий шматок сала и пошлости и венерических заболеваний, блядь?
To come back to the Stanford prison experiment, one factor that may have played into the escalation of the guards' behavior was that they felt righteous in what they were doing. Zimbardo assigned participants to the role of the guard, and as such, they may have felt compelled to feel that whatever they were doing was justified. Their goal, after all, was to maintain order. Zimbardo and Craig Haney later wrote in 1977 that much social psychological evidence indicates that the best way to change attitudes or beliefs is to get people to behave as if they believe in what they are doing. This finding augurs ill for the individual maintaining self while performing institutional roles that are dehumanizing or detrimental to others. In a similar vein, Hughes referred to the conduct of the SS during the genocide as a prime example of dirty work in 1964. The slaughter of the Jews, he argued, arose not from some dispositional sadism integral to the German people, but from a familiar process of moral rationalization. Dirty work is an unpleasant activity carried out in good conscience by those who have convinced themselves that their actions serve a greater good. It's a dirty job, but someone has to do it. In other words, immoral and heinous acts in human history were likely perceived to be particularly moral by those who committed them, and also those who failed to oppose them. Now, despite the infamous and striking findings of the Stanford prison experiment published in 1971, many experts criticized the paper's findings, methods, and frankly, ethics. The living conditions the mock prisoners lived through, such as the terrible food, lack of daylight exposure, and abuse alone could have led to the development of psychological problems, and in fact, two such participants suffered from a nervous breakdown. I mean, then again, despite how absurd it may sound to say, these were different times, and applying modern ethical standards to research conducted decades ago does not hold as strong criticism for the research findings. In fact, one could argue that the experimental findings outweigh the very harm experienced by the participants. The ends justify the means. However, not only is this argument flawed as it is a slippery slope for even greater unethical research, but perhaps the findings of the study itself are flawed, if not entirely unrepresentative of real life. For instance, Erich Fromm correctly pointed out in 1973 that the personality pretest administered by Zimbardo and colleagues may not have detected a predisposition for sadistic or masochistic behavior among the participants. Some researchers further claim that the original advertisement may have attracted people who were predisposed to authoritarian beliefs. Furthermore, there is some indication that the experimenter's results were fabricated, or at least not reported entirely correctly. A 2019 archival analysis of the Stanford University's records revealed that there were some major discrepancies between what Zimbardo reported and what actually happened. Zimbardo himself has often claimed that he maintained a very systematic, unbiased data records, but the archival materials revealed just the opposite. There were no systematic and unbiased or complete records. Letexia, in 2019, found that no data was even collected on the third day of the experiment, and only about 10% of the 150 hours of the experiment, including the guard orientation day, were recorded by either video, 6 hours total, or audio, 8 hours, making these records clearly unrepresentative of the entire experiment. Furthermore, Zimbardo has maintained that the guards and prisoners did not receive any specific training in these roles. Supposedly, the guards themselves created a series of ways to mistreat the prisoners. Archival documents, however, reveal that the guards were essentially told how to behave. If anything, the experiments may be more a demonstration of obedience rather than group identity, but we will get to that point later. Of note, one of the guards later stated the following: "I was helping them create an uncomfortable experience so they could get some results." This statement points to a major and unfortunately common limitation of psychological research. When the participants see through the experimenter's purpose, there is a risk of them performing in a specific way to please the experimenter. This is referred to as demand characteristics. Ultimately, there is no way to tell if the guards would have exhibited the same behavior if they had not been participating in an experiment. Nevertheless, Zimbardo sticks to his guns, and in his most recent book, The Lucifer Effect, he insists that we blame the Iraqi Abu Ghraib prison, I can't say that for the life of me, the Iraqi Abu Ghraib prison abuse on the situation, though he expands it to the system in total. In his book, he affirms that there are 7 social processes that grease the slippery slope of evil. Mindlessly taking the first small step, dehumanization of others, de-individuation of others, diffusion of personal responsibility, blind obedience to authority, uncritical conformity to group norms, passive tolerance of evil through inaction or indifference. His notion that bad systems create bad situations, create bad apples, create bad behaviors, and even in good people, avoids all reference to personality traits and emotional development. It begs an immediate question. If traits and emotional development are not involved in creating good people, then why in a genocide do some people rescue? We will come back to this question later. Even if findings were overstated and the conclusions were purposefully sensationalized, there is no doubt that group identity influences our behavior. A less well-known but equally important experiment by Levine illustrates this perfectly. In 2005, Levine and colleagues published a paper that examined how group perception affects a person's willingness to help another person. In a first study, participants were primed to think about themselves as Manchester United football fans. In other words, they were reminded of their allegiance to that particular football club and therefore their membership to that specific group. After this unconscious reinforcement, participants were directed to another room. On the way, they would see a person running by and fall who, depending on the experimental condition, either wore a Manchester United team shirt, a Liverpool Football Club shirt, or simply an unbranded sports shirt. Although it may seem ridiculous, participants helped the person far more often if that person wore a Manchester United shirt than a Liverpool or unbranded shirt. This is highly indicative of own group favoritism. However, in a second study, when the authors instead primed participants to think about themselves as football fans, the participants were more likely to help the person if they wore a Manchester United or Liverpool shirt, rather than an unbranded sports shirt. This finding suggests that in-group favoritism boundaries can be manipulated and, in this case, clearly as either broadened or shrunk. So, what does all of this suggest? In short, social identity theory proposes that, depending on how one's own group thinks about and presents an outgroup, this can seriously impact how one acts towards members of that specific outgroup. Notably, even when such group differences are drawn by chance or arbitrary differences in opinion, how one acts towards the other group can be highly negative, if not even abusive. Despite this grim conclusion, there is, thankfully, some hope. It is possible, as you saw, to encourage people to expand the boundaries of their group, to include people who would have been considered to be an out-group member. More specifically, this is done by encouraging the importance of a common identity factor, such as being a football fan in the experiment I talked about previously. Therefore, by expanding the inclusiveness of the in-group by means of a higher level of social categorization, in-group bias can be decreased. Finally, recent work has shown that creating a common in-group identity is particularly effective in reducing out-group bias when it is combined by simultaneously stressing the ties within the subgroups, such as being a Manchester United fan or a Liverpool fan, and the overarching common identities, i.e. being a football fan. Such dual identities work particularly well because they secure subgroup distinctiveness, while at the same time they create common ground with the outgroup.